I'm Helen Fulton. I'm the Professor of Medieval Literature at the University of Bristol. And the title of my paper today is The Mortimers in the Writings of Iolo Goch and Adam Usk. So I'm looking at references, particularly to Sir Roger Mortimer, in the work of the Welsh poet Iolo Goch, who was writing in the 1390s, and references to Sir Roger in the chronicle of Adam Usk. Adam was writing just after 1401, but he was looking back to events of the 1380s and 1390s in the last decades of the reign of Richard II. And I'm comparing the image of Sir Roger as the would-be heir to Richard II. First of all by Iolo, who didn't know that Roger was going to die, that Richard II was going to be usurped, compared to Adam Usk, who was writing after those events, and he knew that Sir Roger, however much he admired him and thought he ought to be on the throne, was never going to be King of England. So the focus of my paper is on quite a short historical period in the last decade of the 14th century and the first few years of the reign of Henry IV, which began, of course, in 1399. And as you know, these were very turbulent years in British politics. Richard II, who'd come to the throne in 1377, had to cope, first of all, with the aftermath of the Black Death, which created very severe economic challenges for the English economy. Then there was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the ongoing 100 Years' War, which meant sort of endless campaigning in France, and the power struggle with the Lords Appellant during the later 1380s. The Lords Appellant were the people who wanted to appeal against Richard, very much in the way that Americans use the word impeachment. That was what the Lords Appellant wanted to do to Richard II. During the 1390s, Richard became increasingly vindictive against his enemies. He took revenge on the Lords Appellant by executing or exiling them. And among the exiles was Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, another grandson of Edward III. After the death of John of Gaunt in 1399, who was Henry's father and Richard's uncle and his main mentor, Richard disinherited Henry, confiscating his lands. And this was enough to precipitate Henry's coup against Richard. Henry arrived in England in June 1399 and marched against Richard, deposing him and having himself crowned as Henry IV late in 1399. Richard's fate is unclear, but he died as a prisoner, probably in the castle at Pontefract, and quite possibly not of natural causes. So these were decisive decades in British history, from the 1370s to about 1410, not even mentioning the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr, which broke out in 1400. One of our main historical sources for this period, as you've already heard, is the Latin chronicle written by Adam Usk. Adam was a cleric born around the middle of the 14th century who died in 1430. His chronicle, which survives in two sections in two different manuscripts, was intended to be a continuation of Ralph Higden's Polychronicle, a very famous 14th century history of Britain, which ended in the year 1377. So Adam's chronicle continues from that year, starting with the death of Edward III, and goes up until 1421. Adam began writing his chronicle in the spring of 1401, and he finished it when the chronicle ends in 1421, when Henry V was on the throne, and the whole situation in Britain was quite different from when Adam had started. His style is very particular, very distinctive. There are many sort of stops and starts along the way, and sometimes the chronicle reads more like a diary than a chronicle, and the text moves at different paces depending on Adam's circumstances when he was writing it. And there was a particularly long break between 1402 and 1414 when he had to leave England because of his suspected sympathies with Owain Glyndŵr. So in that period between 1402 and 1414, he's writing a lot about European affairs, about the two popes, situation in Rome and so on. So we get a kind of European perspective on what was happening, and British affairs are placed very much in that sort of wider European context. It's not surprising, of course, that the Mortimer family is mentioned in the chronicle of Adam Usk. They were, after all, the Marcher lords of Usk. Usk was held as one of their many estates in the earldom of March. The Mortimer family, as the Earls of March, were therefore Adam's major patrons, sending him to Oxford, where he developed a career as a senior lawyer, and granting him a number of livings in the Mortimer lordships. In his chronicle, Adam expresses his admiration of Sir Roger Mortimer, the 4th Earl, and also his particular warmth and gratitude towards Sir Edmund Mortimer, Roger's father, the 3rd Earl of March, who died in Ireland in 1381, when he was on military service there as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland on behalf of Richard II. So this is something of what Adam says about Edmund Mortimer. Nor must I omit to say something about Edmund, the father of this Roger. This Edmund, through his innate qualities, as well as his diligence and warlike valour, in which he surpassed all the other mortals of his time, succeeded remarkably within the space of the 2 years that he spent as Lieutenant of Ireland in reducing that whole country, which was in rebellion at the time of his arrival there, to unity, peace and submission to England. Given his personal connection with the Mortimers, as well as their leading role in the politics of the period that Adam is describing, his references to the family are only to be expected. What is perhaps slightly more surprising is to find the Mortimers mentioned in the poetry of Iolo Goch, a Welsh praise poet composing to the leading families of Wales and the March in the second half of the 14th century. What I hope to do in this paper is to show that Adam Usk and Iolo Goch were part of the same world and shared some of the same cultural references. We have no evidence that they knew each other, but they certainly moved in similar circles along the March of Wales. Adam was almost certainly a Welsh speaker who had many Welsh friends and colleagues in South Wales, where he held a number of livings at various stages. When Adam died early in 1430, the beneficiaries to his will were, apart from the clerics and nuns of the parish of Usk, which was his hometown, the other beneficiaries were all members of the Welsh gentry. And this is an extract. That's the map. This is an extract from his will. So these are some of the beneficiaries of his will. And I've highlighted in purple the names of the Welsh people to whom he's left bequests of various kinds. This is basically Chris Gibbon Wilson's translation of the Latin, but I have taken some liberties with the names in turning them back into the Welsh spellings, whereas Chris tends to anglicise the names. I've turned them back into what would have been the Welsh spellings, and that makes it very clear that the people he's leaving money to, Griffith ap Gwilym, Meirig ap Ieien ap Maredydd, Griffith Vychan, Thomas ap Maredydd, Gwenllian Ferch, Dafydd ap Griffith, Ferch meaning the daughter of, and so on. It's very clear that these are members of the Welsh-speaking Welsh gentry families around the March of Wales. So these were members of Adam's personal circle of friends and patrons among the Welsh Marcher gentry. These personal names, with the use of ap or vab or mab, meaning son, and Ferch or merch, daughter, indicate Welsh-speaking families who would, like Adam, also be able to speak English, probably French, and in the case of Adam and his clerical colleagues, to write in Latin. So this was the reality of living in the multilingual and multicultural environment of the March, where Welsh gentry families lived under the jurisdiction of the English Marcher lords, and yet retained their own language, culture, and laws. And this is where I can perhaps go to the map to show you the Marcher lordships all divided up there into tiny little bits and pieces and different estates. And many of you will be familiar, of course, with the Mortimer estates, which extended from Usk and Caerleon right down in the southeast, up through the central March, and then started again around the northeast including Denbigh, so very extensive estates of the Mortimer family during the 14th and early 15th century. One aspect of this multicultural environment was the practice of Welsh praise poets to compose poems not only to Welsh gentry families, but to members of the English nobility living in the Marcher lordships. Relations between Welsh and English in Wales had been slowly repairing themselves after the conquest of North Wales by Edward I in 1284. So English rule had been imposed throughout Wales from that time, from 1284. Outside the Marcher lordships, you can see the Principality, so-called Principality of Wales, which were the areas of native Welsh princely rule that had been conquered by Edward I in 1284. And these were now governed as crown lordships, lordships of the crown, using officials put into place by the crown, by the king, appointed by the king to run the principality. And then, of course, the Marcher lordships were governed by the Marcher lords themselves. So there was a kind of two-tier system in Wales after 1284. Huge change for the Welsh people who lost their native aristocracy after 1284. So English rule was now prevalent throughout Wales, managed through the Marcher lordships on the one hand and through the newly formed crown lordships in the north and the west. But there were nonetheless opportunities for the upper levels of Welsh society, the uchelwyr, or the high men, the noblemen of Wales. There were opportunities for this emerging class of senior gentry to hold senior official posts in the English administration of Wales, and therefore they became increasingly assimilated into the English ruling elites through occupation and also through intermarriage. This kind of assimilation, which of course is very typical of colonised nations, worked in both directions. English Marcher families, many of them already with Welsh antecedents or currently married to Welsh partners, recognised the status and social acceptance that Welsh praise poetry could bring to them in a land that was in many ways still divided, both culturally and legally. One of the first poets to address praise poetry to the English nobility after the trauma of 1284 was Iolo Goch. Iolo, whose epithet Goch, it's a form of the word coch, which is an adjective meaning red in Welsh. And so he's Iolo the Red, which probably means he had red hair. And it's given the English surname Gough, G-O-U-G-H. Gough is a form of coch, meaning red or red-haired. Iolo lived from about 1325 to about 1398, but as is the case with most of the Welsh praise poets of the 14th and 15th centuries, we know very few details about his life. The detail of his life went completely unrecorded. It's only sort of chance references in historical documents that gives us any information at all about this army of Welsh praise poets who were going around the country composing to all the great families of Wales. We do know that Iolo lived in Llecryd, near Denbigh, in the Vale of Clwyd, an area that retained a very strong sense of traditional Welsh culture, despite or perhaps because of its subjection to English rule. And at the time when Iolo was composing poetry, the lordship of Denbigh, as I said, belonged to the Mortimers of Wigmore. Iolo's patrons represented the leading class of Welsh clerics and gentry in northeast Wales. So he sang praise poems to two successive bishops of the cathedral at St Asaph. He sang to the Tudor family of Penmynydd in Anglesey, the ancestors of the later Tudor family, and he sang to Owain Glyndŵr himself before the rebellion broke out, when Owain was living as a wealthy, prosperous farmer, a leading landowner on his estates near Llangollen. But in addition to these patrons, who represented the highest class of Welshmen after 1284, Iolo Goch paid due homage to the English nobility, whose presence in Wales and the March was inescapable. He even composed a complete praise poem to Edward III, and this is a poem quite unparalleled for its time. We don't see anything similar to this, a Welsh praise poem addressed to a ruling English monarch. something quite extraordinary. We don't see anything similar until the middle of the 15th century, when the poets again began explicitly to take sides in the Wars of the Roses. The key point, I think, about Iolo's favourable attitude towards the English nobility is that he perceived such men entirely from the viewpoint of Wales. The English nobility were only of value insofar as they represented Welsh interests, as did Edward III, for example, in his military campaigns, which was the reason for composing a praise poem to him. Or, better still, he praised Englishmen who were related, however tenuously, to the princely dynasties of Wales, and could thus be regarded as honorary Welshmen. And this was the thinking, of course, behind Iolo's famous praise poem to Sir Roger Mortimer, the 4th Earl of March, born at Usk in 1374 and killed in battle in Ireland in 1398. Iolo's poem to him was probably composed in the 1390s, either just before Sir Roger left for Ireland in 1394 or on one of his visits back to his estates in the Welsh borders. We know from Adam Usk that Roger was summoned to the King's Parliament at Shrewsbury over the winter of 1397-1398, so that's another possible moment when the poem could have been composed, near the end of Iolo's life and also near the end of Sir Roger's life. For Iolo Goch, Sir Roger represented the best aspects of march and lordship in Wales, and he represented the kind of leadership so evidently lacking in the king at that time in the 1390s. The main theme of the poem is Sir Roger's military record and his destiny to defeat the Irish, a theme that is announced at the beginning and again at the end of the poem. So these are the first 6 lines of the poem. Sir Roger, the Welsh version of Sir Roger, Sir Roger, Azir, Esawr, Sir Roger o'r Mortimer mawr, Roger ieuanc, planc, plum lwyd, Sarf air o'r hil Sir Raff wyd, Ros arlwyd, Roger erglair, Ryswr, cwnchwerol, can cair. And you can see the English translation there yourselves. So he opens with this great sort of panegyric mode to Sir Roger as the warlike serpent of the line of Sir Ralph Mortimer, hero, conqueror of 100 fools. Towards the end of the poem, he talks about Sir Roger's campaigns in Ireland, and he ends on a note that Roger is going to take the lead in Ireland and conquer the Irish. So in the last few lines of the poem, he says, Brusha achlemia achan, gwlad Ulster, glod Elistan, Llyna gyfoeth llawn geifalch, Myndyn dau a myndwn dalch, Nôl dal gred nial fyner, Ci falstwff, cif o Ulster, Ti a ledi, clwch ti clod, Bobl Ulster, bol ail ystod. So these sort of Anglo names forced into a kind of Welsh phonetics. But he's urging Roger on to complete the conquest of the restless Irish in Ireland, saying, you will cut down the people of Ulster with every other stroke. Elistan was a Welsh lord of the 11th century, so he's comparing him to a great former Prince of Wales, very common form of praise in medieval praise poetry, to compare what was probably a harmless landowner in most cases with the great military heroes of the past. A second theme of the poem, apart from Roger's military prowess, is Sir Roger's genealogy. So we're coming back to the idea of genealogy. And according to Iolo, the blood of France, England, Wales and Ireland all intermingles, represented by the 4 heraldic colours on Sir Roger's coat of arms. I'm sorry it's so small. That was the best image I could find of the coat of arms of this particular Sir Roger Mortimer. So according to Iolo, the blood of France is represented by the gold colour, which comes out here as that sort of mustard yellow, while the azure colour, the blue on the coat of arms, represents his Irish blood coming through his mother Philippa, who was descended from the Earls of Ulster, though of course this didn't necessarily make them Irish, in fact it didn't make them Irish at all, as we can see from Iolo's references to the Irish. But Roger also has English blood, represented by silver or white, which he says is the colour of the white dragon. So this is the description of his English blood. Tai hyd yn y lai mai Loegr, a bu ta'r lle gorau yn Lloegr, yn achen y ddraig wenwiw, rawn llais y mae'r arian lliw. Bw I Loegr a'i mar lygad, anwyl iawn wyd yn y wyd. Ion I Wigmore, enwog mawr, a yw'r y mars a Louis Mawr. Lord of great famous Wigmore, Earl of March. Great provision, meaning he makes great provision for his retainers and poets and so on. So it's clear from this that Sir Roger's Englishness is acceptable, mainly because he's a Marcher Lord and therefore he's invested in Wales as well as in England. He was Lord of Usk and Caerleon and Ludlow. His family seat was at Wigmore, so his estates in Wales were very extensive. He was at this time in the 1390s more or less accepted as the heir to Richard II, due to his descent from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, the second son of Edward III. So Iolo acknowledges the importance of Roger's English inheritance as the line that will bring him ultimately to the throne, the descendant of Sir Lionel. But of course it's Roger's Welsh descent that is of prime importance for Iolo. Roger's ancestor, Sir Ralph Mortimer, who lived from 1195 to 1246, had married Gwladys Ddu, the daughter of one of the great princes of Wales, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, or Llywelyn the Great, who lived from about 1173 to 1240. Llywelyn was the king of Gwynedd, the northwestern part of Wales, and in his time he was ruler over the whole of Wales. He was one of the princes who came closest to uniting the whole of Wales under one king. This is why Iolo mentions Sir Ralph in line 4 of the poem, which I showed you earlier, Sarf Air or Hill Sir Ralphwyd, you are a warlike serpent of Sir Ralph's line, because it was Sir Ralph who married into the Welsh princely family. And this is why he refers to Ralph's Welsh connection as Gwyndy Gwyw, worthy Venedotians, meaning the people of Gwynedd, the kingdom ruled by Llywelyn. This is what Iolo says about Roger's Welsh connections, represented by the colour of cinnabar or bright red on his coat of arms. So he calls him, in Cider of Song, the blood of the red dragon is the cinnabar. So Hwdrydd cerdd, gwaed y ddraig goch yw'r sinobr y sianoch. Am hynny bydd hi baedd hwyw, a ro eto air o twyw. Cael da yw cwyl dy awydd, cael gwrfod, rhagod, pwyd hwydd. Gras a thyr a'i groes wrthyd, a'i llys, a'i gadlys I gyd, gorau lle, ail gallion, a si uwch o'r ynys hon. So as an explicit connection with the Welsh princes and reference to Arthur, sort of standing in for that line of British kings, of whom Sir Roger is the descendant. And he refers to Caerleon, which is one of the great courts of Arthur. So Iolo is reminding Roger of his Welsh heritage, including the great British King Arthur, whose magnificent court was said to have been at Caerleon, one of the Mortimer estates. So as Roger himself is the Lord of Caerleon, this confirms that he's inherited the greatness of Arthur as a military leader and as a king, referring implicitly to Roger's status as heir to the throne. So far then we can see that Iolo's poem focuses on the great military career of Sir Roger and the brilliance of his heritage as a member of the Mortimer family. Not only is he descended from a line of kings and destined to become a king himself, that was certainly how it appeared in the 1390s, but he was also effectively a Welshman, a man with the blood of Llywelyn the Great running through his veins. Here was a man who deserved the praise of a great Welsh praise poet. But there's another important theme in the poem, and that is prophecy. Prophecy is a key theme of Welsh literature from its earliest recorded texts, Not so much religious prophecy, though that does appear occasionally, but political prophecy. It's a great strain of political prophecy running right through Welsh literary tradition. One of the earliest texts written in Welsh is called Almes Prydain, the Prophecy of Britain, composed in the first half of the 10th century, when the Anglo-Saxon king Athelstan was holding the Welsh to ransom, demanding tribute from the Welsh princes in acknowledgement of English rule. According to the poem, the Welsh would rather rise up in battle against the English, drawing on their allies among the Bretons, the Vikings and the Irish, than continue to suffer oppression from the Saxons. This 10th century poem is styled as a long prophecy about the future of the Welsh, and it is simply this, that the British people, ancestors of the Welsh, were once the rulers of the whole island of Britain, but were violently dispossessed of their lands and their rightful rule by the Saxons. In time, says the prophecy, a British hero will return, who with the help of his companions will throw off the yoke of Saxon oppression and restore a British king to the throne of Britain. This is the prophecy made in Almes Prydain, embedded in a long catalogue of injustices and demands for reparation. This Welsh prophecy of the returning king had an astonishingly long life in Welsh literature. It was clearly known to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the 12th century author of the Latin text Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, written in about 1138. Geoffrey incorporated it into his famous Prophecies of Merlin. These prophecies, often very obscure, but basically describing the misfortunes of the island of Britain under first the Saxons and then the Normans, were originally published as a standalone text, the Prophetiae Merlini. But they proved so popular that Geoffrey reissued them as part of his History of the Kings of Britain. He sort of inserted them into the larger chronicle, and the prophecies are embedded in the chronology of the British kings between Vortigern and Arthur, in that long list of British kings. Merlin is represented as a boy wizard, and he utters this long series of prophecies which have at their heart the prophecy of the ultimate return of a British king to the throne of England. So it's a sort of set of wild prophecies about a series of one king after another, culminating in the return of a British king to the throne. Geoffrey's prophecies of Merlin entered the medieval canon. As part of his British history, they were translated into numerous European languages, including French, German, Italian, Dutch, Irish, and of course also Welsh, with Welsh versions of the history appearing from the early 13th century. Geoffrey's more elaborate prophecies coincided with the native Welsh tradition of the returning king, which was alluded to by the 12th century court poets and taken up even more explicitly following the death of Llywelyn ap Griffith in 1284, the last independent Prince of Wales, conquered and killed by Edward I. In the immediate aftermath of this conquest and the destruction of the princely class in Wales, the poets concentrated on finding new patrons from among the emerging elites of Wales, those uchelwyr who held senior offices in the English administration, and those among the English marcher families who intermarried with the Welsh and therefore took on some responsibility for supporting the traditional culture of the poets. The old prophecies of a Welsh return to power seemed less relevant to this new order in Wales during the 14th century, when everybody's efforts were focused on finding a way to live together, to live peacefully in a new political context. But right at the century's end, in the 1390s, at that moment when the reign of Richard II was faltering and there seemed to be a moment of crisis, we see the first hints of this prophecy being recycled in a new form. And in fact, Iolo Goch, in his praise poem to Roger Mortimer, is among the earliest of the Welsh poets, after the publication of Geoffrey's history, to allude to this prophecy in his work. He gives the first hint of it in the opening section of the poem, where he heaps praise on Sir Roger Mortimer as a descendant of the Welsh princes. So he says, Arwraeth dy liniaeth lawr, wir bydd llwyth yw'r Aberffraw, draig yn y swydd yr eigiawn, dragwn aer, darogan iawn y ddwyf, Madws it the fod Gymru lle rydlyddi glod. It's time for you to come to Wales. I am prophesying truly. It's time for you to come. Roger is described as a descendant of the Lord of Aberfraw, and Aberfraw in Anglesey was the chief court of the princes of Gwynedd. And the Lord referred to here is Llewellyn the Great, the father of Gwladys V, who married Sir Ralph Mortimer. The poet says it is time, uses the word madus, possibly from the Latin maturus, meaning it's high time. You know, it's a mature moment. Now is the time for Roger to come to Wales, implying that this is his role as the prophesied hero who will return to restore Wales to its rightful place in the rulership of Britain. So when Roger becomes king, as Iolo assumed he would be representing Wales. He would be bringing Welsh rule back to the English throne. Iolo returns to this theme of prophecy later in the poem, after extolling the genealogy and military accomplishments of Sir Roger. He uses the word darogan, again, prophecy, darogan. Darogan yw mae'n draig ni a linear gwaith eleni, o ben y llew glew I gledd, coroni'r car I Wynedd. It's prophesied that it's our dragon which will perform the feast this year. So the dragon, the red dragon, representing the people of Wales. The reference to lion means the rightful line of kings. That's what the lion meant in prophecy. So in this case, it was the line of Richard II and his rightful heirs, who are the Mortimers. As one of the family of Gwynedd, Sir Roger is positioned as a future Welsh king of England, the object and aim of the prophecy. The use of animal imagery in Welsh prophecy was made popular by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who used it extensively in his prophecies of Merlin, where the figure of the lion represents a series of powerful, rightful kings. Other animals, such as the dragon, the serpent, the wolf, and the boar, represent rival kings or armies who challenge the lion and often seize power for themselves in violent ways. Iolo's references to Sir Roger Mortimer as a dragon and a serpent, and his references to the red dragon of Wales and the white dragon of England, recall the language of prophecy articulated by Geoffrey of Monmouth and position Roger as someone who will fight for his inheritance. If necessary, he will fight for his rightful position as king. And Iolo uses the theme of timeliness again in line 69, the last two lines on this slide, when he says, Amserol, misi Herod, it ddeffroi I gloed y glod. It is time, amserol, timely, it's time. Misi Herod, I am a herald, meaning I'm announcing, I'm prophesying this, for you to awake, the idea of the sleeping hero, rise up, now it's time to awake to secure your praise. In other words, Iolo is the herald, the prophet, announcing the news that now is the time for the king in waiting to awake and return to his people to claim his rightful crown. In this poem then, Iolo Goch alludes to this wider tradition of Welsh prophecy that hovered just below the surface of formal praise poetry, representing a popular tradition strengthened by Geoffrey of Monmouth, that a British king, that is, a Welshman descended from the earlier princes and kings of Britain, would return to claim the throne that had been lost to the Saxon invaders. It's interesting that this tradition surfaces quite briefly but unmistakably in Iolo's poem, carefully worded so as not to imply any dissatisfaction with Richard II, since this would amount to treason. Instead, the poet looks forward with triumph to the succession of Sir Roger Mortimer, who, because of his Welsh inheritance, fulfills the prophetic role of the returning hero of Britain who takes the throne of England. This prophecy, re-entering the tradition of Welsh court poetry through Iolo's poem, was to become a staple of the Welsh poetic tradition from this point until late in the 15th century. Throughout the Wars of the Roses, various Welsh heroes were claimed to be the Mab Darogan, the son of prophecy, whose triumphant return to claim the throne would fulfil the prophecy that the British or Welsh people would once again be the rightful kings of the island of Britain. The prophecy adapted itself to changing political times, emerging at certain points when Wales needed to assert its independence or when the kingship was in any way insecure. It's interesting then that Iolo Goch chose to allude to the prophecy in the 1390s. He may well have had a sense of the fragility of Richard's position at that time, and even perhaps of Henry Bolingbroke's designs on the throne. At that time of political uncertainty, it was timely indeed to assert that Roger was the rightful heir, whose claim was further strengthened by ancient prophecy. It is time, says Iolo, for a Welsh king to return. Turning back now to Adam Usk and his chronicle, what does he have to say about Sir Roger Mortimer? And of course, Adam is writing, unlike Iolo, he's writing just a few years later where everything has changed. Sir Roger has died, Richard has been deposed, and Henry IV has taken the throne. So in the space of 2 to 3 years, the whole landscape of Britain has changed. We've already seen that Adam had a particular affection for Roger's father, Edmund, the 3rd Earl of March, who supported Adam through his legal studies at Oxford. But about his son, Roger, Adam is even more adulatory. He describes Roger's appearance at the King's Parliament in Shrewsbury in January 1398, an event where the tyranny of Richard II was made evident through his treatment of his magnates. So Adam says that noble knight, the Earl of March, Lieutenant of Ireland, also came to this Parliament, having been summoned thither. A young man of the highest character, he had no part in the king's schemes and was quite innocent of any complicity in his evils. He wants to make it clear that Roger had no part in Richard's deposition. The people welcomed him warmly and with joyful hearts. 20,000 of them, wearing party-coloured hoods of red and white, his livery, went out to meet him on his arrival, in the hope that through him they might be delivered from this king's wickedness. So Roger is the epitome of the English nobility, brave in battle, immune to corruption, worshipped by his people, and yet able to remain at least outwardly loyal to a hostile king who was actually conspiring against him. More than this, however, is that Adam shows quite clearly that Sir Roger was born to be king. And he does this through a remarkable series of verbal genealogies. We've seen examples of visual genealogies done on rolls, but what Adam gives us is a verbal genealogy. The longest of these goes on for pages and pages and traces Roger's birth all the way back to Adam, the original Adam, believe it or not, via the Welsh princes, the British kings, the Trojans, and on back through history. And he's drawing on a model of British history popularised by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he's also drawing on traditional Welsh genealogies of their princes. So following this, Adam provides supplementary lines for Roger's Welsh ancestor, Gwladys Ddu, daughter of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, who through her mother, Joan, the daughter of King John, can trace her lineage back to William the Conqueror. Then there's another genealogy of Roger's mother, Philippa, the granddaughter of Edward III, tracing her lineage back to Edward I and Henry III. What all this amounts to is the same message that we get from Iolo Goch's poem. Sir Roger Mortimer is the man best qualified to become the next King of England. Qualified not only by his military achievements and his noble character, but more importantly by his impeccable lineage on both his father's and his mother's side. With the death of Sir Roger, it is his son, Edmund, the 5th Earl, who should inherit Roger's claim to the throne. Writing in 1401, not long after Henry IV took the throne, Adam is careful not to say, in so many words, that the throne should rightfully belong to the Mortimers. But the implication is clearly there in his words. Talking again of Roger's descent, he says, "Besides this glorious descent from the noble kings of Britain, Italy, Troy, England, France and Spain, what more can be said? Hearken to the way that the royal line of the Earls of March has prospered." And on he goes through Philippa, the estates that they hold both in the Welsh Marches and also in Suffolk as well. So he concludes that bit by saying, "And being united with the royal line, it is in truth worthy to rise to the very highest degrees of honour." So he's more or less saying it's the Mortimers who should be king. This is as far as Adam dares to go, but he's made his point. The key phrase is second-born son, that genealogical term, the second-born son. Lionel, Philippa's father and Sir Roger's grandfather, was the second son of Edward III, which should put his descendants ahead of those of the younger sons of Edward III, including Henry Bolingbroke, whose father, John of Gaunt, was merely the fourth son. Just as Iolo Goch referred to Roger's lineage and stressed his claim to the throne through Lionel, calling him Uwyr Sir Leonel, grandson of Sir Lionel, so Adamasc makes a watertight case by exploring every aspect of Roger's lineage. There is one more thing that Adamasc and Iolo Goch share, apart from their admiration for Sir Roger Mortimer and his family, and that is their interest in prophecy. Adamasc refers to a number of prophecies throughout his chronicle, particularly those associated with the deposition of Richard II in 1399, a moment of crisis, of course, when numerous prophecies were circulating, and they form part of a common stock of prophetic and proverbial sayings current throughout England, which tended to resurface at moments of extreme instability or political crisis. On the death of John of Gaunt in 1399 and the return from exile of his son Henry, now Duke of Lancaster, Adam claims that this return of Henry fulfilled the prophecy of John of Bridlington, a series of verses written in Latin, probably composed earlier in the 14th century, which had great traction in England among clerical writers and chroniclers of the period, and they adapted the words attributed to John of Bridlington to whatever political situation was current at the time. That's the beauty of prophecy, you can make it fit whatever situation you want. Following this reference to Bridlington's prophecy, Adamasc compares it to the prophecy of Merlin. So he says, according to the prophecy of Merlin, this Duke Henry, that's Duke of Lancaster, is the eaglet, the Pulus Aquile, the chick or the baby eagle, for he was the son of John. Following Bridlington, however, he should rather be the dog, because of his livery of linked collars of greyhounds, and because he came in the dog days, that usually means July, and because he drove utterly from the kingdom countless numbers of harts, the hart being the livery of King Richard, and I'll just put the arms of King Richard there so you can see the harts. So this is another example of trying to fit contemporary events to the prophecies of Merlin, applying the animal symbols to various figures and their heraldic signs or liveries. Drawing on both Merlin and Bridlington, Adamasc is, like Iolo Goch, making a point about the rightful succession to the throne. Merlin prophesied about a series of great kings, one of which was the eagle. And in his interpretation of the prophecy, Adam suggests that the eagle represents Henry, Duke of Lancaster, who was the son of John of Gaunt. But the prophecy of Bridlington offers a different use of symbols, in which Henry is more like a dog driving away the harts. Images which do not come from the Merlin tradition at all, but are later symbols, referring to the reign of Richard, based on his livery of the white hart. By presenting two different traditions of prophecy, neither of which position Henry as the undisputed and rightful heir of Richard, Adam raises significant doubts about whether Henry is in fact the prophesied heir at all. To conclude then, I've been suggesting that the Welsh poet Iolo Goch and the chronicler Adamasc, both contemporaries during a time of significant political upheaval, share a number of cultural references and literary strategies, and that this shared tradition represents their regional location on the March of Wales. Both identify primarily with the Welsh side of the border. They speak Welsh, come from Welsh families, mix in the circles of the Welsh gentry along the march, and they share the native literary traditions of poetry and prophecy. Both are strong supporters of the Mortimer family and their claims to the throne, based to a large extent on the Welshness lying behind the Mortimer family tree. Both draw on a particularly Welsh tradition of prophecy, the Merlin tradition of a Welsh return to the throne. And this tradition can itself be associated with the area of the march, where it's found in 15th century manuscripts in both Welsh and English versions. Both believe that Roger Mortimer, or following him his son Edmund, should have been on the throne instead of Henry, a view that lay behind the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr in 1400. As I said at the beginning, there's no evidence that Iolo Goch and Adamasc knew each other, and that seems to me a shame. if they had ever met, they would certainly have had a lot to talk about. Thank you.
Yes?
How do the colours, the livery colours, red and white, fit into our picture?
Fit into which picture?
The question is the reference to Roger Mortimer being greeted on his arrival at Shrewsbury.
Oh, I see.
Adam's reference to 20,000 of his supporters being there, wearing his livery colours of red and white. And I mean, that's a question that's been asked before in terms of, obviously, the Mortimer colours are usually Hugh, technical terms.
I just think they're different, aren't they? The livery colours from the coat of arms.
Yes. But I'll use non-heraldic terms of yellow and blue, gold and azure. Yes, we assume that livery colours are different to the colours on the coat of arms.
And each individual had their own colours. You know, it wasn't a family thing that was common to everybody in the family. Each individual. So Sir Roger had his own colours, and red and white indicated followers of his, supporters of his, in the same way that football fans wear their colours.
Sorry, Kirsten?
I was just going to say, the red and white is actually sort of, I don't know whether he's being a bit naughty, but it ties back to the red dragon and the white dragon. I think there's a bit of...
Could well be, yeah.
Kirsten just saying that perhaps the red and the white colours of the 4th of March are picking up the themes of the royal descent from Wales and from England. There was one more hand.
Wasn't Iolo Goch Glyndwr personal bar?
I don't think there's any hard and fast evidence. The question was Iolo Goch the personal bard or poet of Owain Glyndwr? I don't think there's any hard and fast evidence for that, but he certainly was patronised by Owain Glyndwr. He went to Owain's court at Sycharth and praised the court and the life of the court and the architecture of the house. So yeah, he certainly was a poet who sang praises.
And wasn't he a seer as well, forecasting triumphs for Glyndwr?
I don't know about that. I think Iolo sort of made those general prognostications about anyone he was praising, that they would achieve great things. I don't think he thought Owain was anything particular.
Right, thank you. We'll need to finish there. Again, one of the things that, the same when we heard Helen talk in the summer, one of the things I was thinking sitting there was I could just sit here all morning listening to Helen speak the poems in Welsh. It is lovely, isn't it?